I think what's interesting is it's not even looking at facts. It's looking at people who don't believe in abortion and what their ideas are regarding the population of this country, right? So whether it's based in fact or not, a lot of far-right folks believe that there's too many communities of color. You hear all this outrage about we're, quote unquote, we are becoming outnumbered, as we as in white folks are becoming outnumbered. Hi, I'm Dee, and welcome to this episode of Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about International Women's Day in the era of Donald Trump. But what is International Women's Day? It's supposed to give focus to women's issue, pay disparities, gender equality, reproductive rights, violence and abuse against women, and usually the focus is on how to further women's rights. But in the era of Trump, in the era of these far-right regimes, we're seeing that International Women's Day this year was about getting back some of the rights that we're seeing that we're losing, rights that we fought for, I identify as a woman, rights that we fought for years and decades. What people don't realize is that International Women's Day was originally International Women's Workers' Day. This day was spurred on by a lot of labor movements. It was originally, in a lot of countries, what helped revolution start, such as in Russia, and helped labor reforms pass in countries like Australia and here in the United States. The women's suffrage movement, that was born out of International Women's Day. But what did Trump deem International Women's Day 2025? I'm going to read this to you. In his declaration about International Women's Day, President Donald Trump said, "No longer will our government promote radical ideologies that replace women with men in spaces and opportunities designed for women, or devastate families by indoctrinating our sons and daughters to begin a war with their own bodies. Instead, my administration will safeguard the great American values of family, truth, well-being, and freedom. By fulfilling my promise to protect women and girls from gender extremism, we have brought back common sense to society." That was an actual memo released by Donald Trump and his administration. As you can see, there's a lot going on here. One, he has again reduced women down to their gender. And two, he has made it very clear that this is not just about women, but what constitutes a quote unquote real woman. This claws back so many protections, so many rights that have been given to transgender women. This claws back so many ideas about the role women and girls have in society. And it's clearly just a political ploy to further his other agendas. In addition, in the same statement, Donald Trump said, "The United States will no longer allow X gender marker on government forms, and the United States Passport Office will now only issue passports with a male or female sex marker matching an individual's biological sex at birth. Today and every day, America's daughters ignite the dreams and develop the character of our next generation." This is only part of an agenda to satisfy the far right's need to define people according to their biological sex at birth. And so what was the theme of International Women's Day outside of Trump? The theme was accelerate action. So according to the World Economic Forum, at the current rate of progress, which has been slowed down by the Trump administration and other far-right regimes, it will take until 2158, which is roughly 5 generations from now, to reach full gender parity. And it's not just about economic parity, it's about access to healthcare, it's about justice for victims of gender-based violence, and access to education for young girls. I think what gets lost in translation is that even though we're talking about the United States healthcare system, the United States effect on public health is actually worldwide. The U.S. decision on abortion has actually become a global conversation. With the rise of Trump, we saw other regimes in other countries that are pretty far right come to power. And what's happening in those countries is now they're talking about abortion rights. In the US, we actually had the strictest rules regarding abortion and the least access to abortion. So if we're seeing countries that had so much reform, so much access, having these critical conversations about removing rights, it's not setting a good precedent. And honestly, it's quite scary for the future. I don't think people realize that at the same time, during Trump's first administration and during his first attempt to claw back abortion access, uh, gender based healthcare, this was actually the era of the quote unquote lean in movement, the girl boss era. And I think what we're learning, during the second administration is how easily that could be taken away from us. The Trump administration is reinstating what's called the global gag rule. The global gag rule is called that because what it does is it prohibits foreign non governmental organizations who receive any sort of assistance from the US from providing legal abortion services or referrals. So, in a sense, it makes it so that you can't even talk about abortion. And so they're calling it the global gag rule because if the US institutes this rule, which they have, it means that they're gonna these organizations that provide access to healthcare for women, that provide access to abortion, access to any sort of gender based health resource, they're going to lose their funding and they can't even talk about abortion, hence the gag rule. This rule was actually enacted under another Republican president, Ronald Reagan, and generally the idea is that every administration gets to decide whether they're employing the rule or not. Donald Trump employed this rule under his first tenure as president, and now he's employing it again. And what we saw is that there are far reaching consequences for this global gag rule. We saw that contraception and vital reproductive services were cut off. We saw that there was a spike in pregnancy related deaths, reproductive coercion, and gender inequality worldwide. Many clinics and health programs had to close their doors, leaving really vulnerable populations of women with nowhere to get birth control, nowhere to get pregnancy care, and nowhere to get any vital services. The idea is if you offer abortions, we're defunding you and we're taking away your ability to offer any sort of care. And so what we're seeing is a lot of these programs, the idea was that they were reaching out to communities that didn't have any other places to go. And a lot of these places in other countries, these were the same clinics that offered treatment for malaria, tuberculosis, other infectious diseases. And so the impact on public health was huge. And we're afraid that what's going to happen is that it's going to happen again. There's a chilling effect. People don't want to talk about abortion. People are afraid to talk about it. And so what happens is a lot of advocates have to sort of pivot the conversation. And when you pivot the conversation and you have to go elsewhere, what we're doing is we're really forgetting about the rights of pregnant people. And so that becomes the next topic of conversation. Abortion is a really big focus on being pro-life, right? Those who say that abortion shouldn't be legal, those who are against abortion, what you always hear is, well, we don't believe in killing babies. But what about the pregnant people? If you're pro-life, how can you have policies that abandon the actual mothers? So what happens in post the overturning in Roe v. Wade? We all sort of knew that the anti-abortion movement wasn't going to end with overturning Roe. We knew they wouldn't stop banning abortions with exceptions for health and life. We knew that they wouldn't stop until abortion was banned for anyone, everywhere, under every circumstance. But I'm actually honestly surprised at how quickly this has come about. Less than 3 years after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, abandoning 50 years of precedent and stripping a lot of American people of their constitutional right, what we're seeing is the quote-unquote most pro-life president in American history. The Trump administration agreed to dismiss the case of United States v. Idaho. This case was filed by the Biden administration. What it sought to do was act as a backstop in states where there were very extreme abortion laws that prevented mothers who were facing death or in the middle of a pregnancy that could kill them from having access to abortion. It sought to ensure the Federal Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which would protect a person's right to emergency abortion, even in states with extreme abortion bans like Idaho. By the Trump administration dismissing this case, we have no fail-safe for mothers who are facing death, for those whose pregnancies can't even come to term. For example, a pregnant person was denied emergency abortion care at 2 different hospitals in Kansas and Missouri after her water broke at 18 weeks of pregnancy, putting her at risk of serious infection, hemorrhaging, or death. Another person lost a fallopian tube and most of an ovary after a hospital in Texas sent her home without treating her ectopic pregnancy. Pregnant patients are being airlifted out of Idaho in order to receive the care they need. Stories like these are now all too common and often tragic and lead to preventable death. And this is becoming a part of American life. So again, are you really pro-life if you're abandoning the pregnant people in crisis? EMTALA, this Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, is a 40-year federal law. And to see it thrown out so callously, again, just tells you what this administration thinks of women.
Do you think that the abortions that are happening is also tied into like the bigger picture of white supremacy?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is it's not even looking at facts. It's looking at people who don't believe in abortion and what their ideas are regarding the population of this country, right? So whether it's based in fact or not, a lot of far-right folks believe that there's too many communities of color. You hear all this outrage about we're, quote unquote, we are becoming outnumbered, as we as in white folks are becoming outnumbered. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the part that's not being said out loud by a lot of people who are pro-abortion, despite the fact that they themselves may get an abortion if they needed to, is that they think that this is some sort of way, twisted as it may be, to control communities of color that they perceive as being the benefactors of access to abortion. They're not looking at actual facts. They're not looking at the fact that, you know, the numbers of people who get abortions are more evenly spread among races and classes than they want to believe. It's not equal. It's not completely equal across the board, but I think it's the perception that matters. And the perception of those who are pushing for denying abortion to certain groups of people, it's the idea of that you want to control. And at the end of the day, it's all about control.
On the federal side, has there been any new developments around harm to women for reasons for them wanting to get the abortion?
Although proponents of overturning Roe v. Wade like to argue that the reason they did it has nothing to do with women's rights, but really about making this a state issue versus a federal issue, it's not entirely true that the federal government isn't impacting states. Even though a lot of states are doing their best to manage and to sort of replicate the abortion laws as they were under Roe v. Wade, we're seeing states like Idaho, states like Missouri that have really extreme abortion laws. In response to that, what the Biden administration did is they enacted the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. Essentially, what that says is if you were raped, if your pregnancy can't go to term and it will cause the mother to die or end up extremely sick or hurt, that they should be granted an exception to those state laws and be able to access an abortion. But under the Trump administration, they actually dismissed the Supreme Court case that allows for enacting that emergency act. And so by taking away that sort of federal fail-safe, that federal safety net, you're saying that the federal government is not going to tell the states what to do, but they're going to impact people's ability to run to the federal government for help if they feel like their state isn't serving them. So that safety net is gone. And so what we're seeing is that the states are also going to take that as sort of the federal government okaying their laws, their strict laws, because the government said there's no need for a fail-safe. Be as strict as you need. And so while the federal government didn't create a law yet to enforce strict abortion laws, what they're doing is they're putting pressure on states to make sure that if they want their laws to be strict, that they can do so without any sort of federal repercussions.
So Donald Trump recently proposed that he'll pass a bill for anyone who gets an abortion to be punishable by death. Have you heard that?
I haven't heard that, but there have been a lot of rumblings about Donald Trump or his administration passing punitive laws that would punish women, people who access abortions. And even we've already seen that doctors can be found liable for providing one in a state where they're not allowed to. And we've seen some arrests actually happen in that area. If it were to come to that, and I have no doubt that there are those trying to make that happen, I do see a long legal battle ahead, but the immediate repercussions is a chilling effect. It makes people who need access feel afraid to come forward. And what we're going to see, which is sort of the reason why abortions became legal in the first place, is we're going to see what used to be called, back alley abortions. We're going to see people trying to take matters into their own hand. We're going to see people going through extreme measures just to access healthcare. And it's going to cause a lot of folks to do something that's a lot more unsafe than just going and getting an abortion. A lot is said about abortion rights, but there's a lot more that goes into what International Women's Day means in the era of Trump when you realize that Trump once deemed himself a protector of women. Other than the not safe for work quote that he's known for when it comes to women, Donald Trump says that he'd act as women's protector by use of economic policies. He likes to pretend that he's a champion for women's equality, especially working women. But a lot of analysts are finding that what he's doing, the economic policies he's employing, are actually making things worse for a lot of working women. Whether it's about equal pay or anti-discrimination, raising wages, providing affordable childcare, supporting unions, or guaranteeing reproductive rights, as we've talked about, the policies that the Trump administration is employing would set women back economically. It's no question either that the current Republican hostility towards working women is well known. In 2021, J.D. Vance said professional women choose a path to misery when they emphasize their careers versus being simply mothers. And those women go on to project that misery on the rest of society. Clearly, there's this idea that women who work are somehow lesser than those who stay home. And yet no one realizes that a woman's work is both at home and outside the home. So let's talk about women in the Civil Rights Act. Project 2025, the super hyper conservative policy that the Trump administration is essentially using as a blueprint for how they're going to administer laws, is calling for reversing executive orders on sex discrimination in the workplace. This would include reversing standards in place since the 1960s that were very much a part of the Civil Rights Act. This is key because if he is able to attack the Civil Rights Act on a tenet within the act that affects people who are also people not necessarily of color, imagine how this administration, which has already shown its racist head, will attack the rights of people of color next. And so if he is to attack the Civil Rights Act on behalf of women, it leads to what we could call a slippery slope, because once you attack any part of the Civil Rights Act, you attack the whole Civil Rights Act. When it comes to equal pay, the Institute for Women's Policy Research reported that women earned 82.7 cents on the dollar compared to men in 2023. But in Trump's first term, he ordered the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to not collect pay and hours data linked to sex, race, and ethnicity. Without this data, it makes it harder for employers, and federal agencies to identify pay disparities and root out employment discrimination. Although this was later reversed by the court, the Trump administration still later stopped collecting the data anyway. There are also a lot of broader anti-worker policies that will disproportionately hurt women, including the debate over minimum wage. Trump and the Republican parties, they oppose increasing the federal minimum wage. It is currently nationally $7.25 per hour, and that hasn't changed since 2009. If adjusted for inflation, it would probably be somewhere around $11 an hour. And if it were to be an actual living wage, it would need to be somewhere around $26 or $27 today. What people don't realize is that a lot of low-wage workers are, in fact, women. So the lack of earning power, it matters to all workers, but especially to women. The Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in 2023, women were 70% of all minimum wage workers, more than 2/3 of the total. And those pay gaps with men will continue to persist all the way up the job ladder. And so when it comes to the debate over minimum wage, it really does matter to women. There are other aspects that are anti-worker that affect women, and that's high-quality childcare. Childcare is essential for working families, but especially for mothers. They said that in a new study, they showed that childcare is one of the most effective pro-worker policies ever. Employers who either provide health care or give leeway for health care, they are supposedly to find that their workers are more productive. But during a vice presidential debate, J.D. Vance claimed that there would be a solution to childcare, yet he's sort of poo-pooed that act every step of the way. And so what we're seeing is that this access to childcare is actually non-existent, and not just non-existent, but being actively fought against by the party in power right now. In addition, there's a lot of hostility to unionization. When it comes to laborers, when it comes to workers, unions are an essential part for giving them a voice at the table. And for women who traditionally don't already have a voice at the table, the ability to be part of a union who's able to speak on their behalf or become union leaders so that they can speak on their own behalf is important. And so, according to the National Women's Law Center, women who are union workers experience more economic security for themselves and their families than non-union members. But as we know, those in power tend to be those with money, and those with money tend to be anti-union. Access to abortion has and continues to have a significant effect on women's educational attainment and job opportunities. Simply put, a lot of women choose, whether people like it or not, to pursue education or careers before pursuing a family. And if they're forced to sort of put those pursuits on pause, then what happens is that we find that they're not able to resume where they were in terms of their jobs or their schooling or their careers. And as a result, they're not able to make up the pay gap. And so what we're seeing is this Trump administration is anti-woman in many ways, whether it is access to basic health care, whether it's equality in the workplace, and just the ability of women to identify as women. We're seeing that the control that the government is putting over women is unfortunately in various sectors. And it's overwhelming. It's really overwhelming. And it's not just women who are affected by taking away DEI policies. It's anybody who honestly does not have fair access, again, to jobs and education. So that could be veterans, that could be those with disabilities, those are women, those are people from marginalized communities, those are people who didn't take a traditional route in terms of education, those are for those who have life experience versus having spent years in traditional careers. And so when we talk about removing DEI, we're not talking about removing spaces designated for people who fall under certain categories: Black, white, female, veteran, disabled. We're talking about taking away those people's abilities to even be seen by those in power, to be seen by those in admissions offices, and being seen by potential employers. DEI is not jumping the line. DEI is just having equal access. And at the heart of everything, whether it's women's rights, whether it's the rights of traditionally marginalized people, it's important to have access, because those in power are the ones actually and most likely jumping the line. Everyone just wants a seat at the same table. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Be sure to check us out next week as well. Go ahead and follow us on all social media platforms at Your Rights Camp, and be sure to follow our YouTube channel at Know Your Rights Camp.